Hey everyone, welcome back to the hardware news recap for the week. This one is packed. There was a ton of news this past week and a good amount of things from the rumor mill, the leak mill, I don't know if that's a thing you can do, and probably better not to ask. And we'll also be talking about just official news from companies, things that aren't leaks and rumors. So we have Intel's i9 13900KF from the leak side of things. We'll also be talking about some AMD AM5 CPU target launch dates, and that is also from the leak side of things. Then officially, Intel has shipped the A380 Arc GPU. This isn't just a laptop GPU. This is a discrete card. Big news from Intel, but it's not available in the US or most of the world yet. So let's get to it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now, and we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. First up is the Intel A380. This is an Arc GPU. The most recent launches in the Arc family have basically only been in laptops. Intel started in South Korea with its laptops and said it would eventually work its way around the world, but has extremely limited supply right now. And it wanted to say, hey, we technically met our launch targets, even though we also said the software is not ready. This is, however, different. This is the first discrete GPU in the Arc lineup, and it is currently only available in China via pre-built systems, but they're planning to bring it out in wider availability next, also still only in China for now. Intel says its target market for the A380 is what it calls mainstream gamers and content creators, and it is targeting that market because there's sort of a dearth in GPUs from AMD and NVIDIA right now in the sub $200 price class, which is what the A380 is. So this is a slot power GPU. There's no auxiliary power connectors on the PCB, and that means it's limited to no more than 75 watts in total, 12 volt, 5 volt, and 3.3 volt. 66 of that can be 12 volts. And the card will be, as Intel claims, capable of 60 FPS with medium settings in a couple of games like League of Legends, not that surprising, frankly, Moonlight Blade, Naraka Blade Point, and PUBG Battlegrounds. Now, this metric, of course, it's kind of meaningless without knowing all of the bench setup and without having comparative data. It gives us an idea for what they're targeting, and their primary target appears to be the RX 6400 based on Intel's internal benchmarks, which is the lowest end modern GPU that AMD makes right now. The A380 has 8 Xe cores, 6 gigabytes of GDDR6 VRAM, and a 96-bit memory bus. Intel notes support for all of the DirectX 12 Ultimate features, including hardware ray tracing. HEVC and H.264 encoding and decoding are supported in the hardware, as well as AV1 encode, which Intel, of course, makes a big deal about being a first. NVIDIA and AMD haven't gotten there yet. Availability will be first from system integrators in China and then as individual components, and eventually there'll be a full launch. For now, the only product that has surfaced is a pre-built PC by MSI made available for pre-order on JD. This may have changed by now, but when we checked, that listing had vanished. Maybe it's come back. Let us know in the comments if you see it out there. And Intel is suggesting a price of 1,030 yuan, which is about $154 US. And again, it's the RX 6400 they're comparing to. The 6400 we checked is currently between 160 and 190 USD for the pricing. And Intel claims a 25% improvement in what it calls a price to performance advantage over the RX 6400, just to give you an idea of where they're targeting. So this is cool. It'll be nice to see some competition. It doesn't need to be more than this one GPU, but something has shipped, and that's a big milestone for Intel. So genuinely, we're looking forward to testing them once they have more out there. If you see the A380 somewhere we can buy it, though, or if you bought one, ping us at team@gamersnexus.net, and we'll buy it off of you. So anyway, we'll try and get our hands on these. But moving on. Leaks. The Intel i9 13900KF preview was leaked by SiSoftware. In the leaks for this one, the 13900, of course, is following up Alder Lake. This is part of what Intel is calling its Raptor Lake family of CPUs. It's a code name for 13,000 series, and the archive.org store of the SiSoftware page indicates an 8 performance core, 16E core configuration with 32 total threads for the i9-13900K and KF. The listing suggests a maximum 250 watt turbo with 65 to 125 watt standard rating for other desktop parts. The SiSoftware page suggests 36 megabytes of L3 cache on the high-end parts, which would be an increase of 6 megabytes over the existing Alder Lake CPUs. PCIe Gen 5 is included in the notes. This is expected at this point, though, because it's already on Alder Lake, and DDR5 support remains present, but it's dropping DDR4. Not much of a surprise, though. SiSoftware mentions that the E-cores move to 16 core and 16 threads maximally, without hyperthreading, and the cache is the same except for L2, which is now at 4 megabytes from 2 megabytes previously, spread between 4 cores. Up next, some big Microsoft news. Microsoft and the Xbox team had a series of announcements over the past week. Actually, Bethesda was in there as well. We'll be talking about them. One of them is Xbox's plan to revive the demo disc. We are reaching a point where, for some portion of the audience, that phrase will have no meaning. And that's very sad, because demo discs were cool, and it was how I got a lot of free hours of gaming without needing to go buy a game. So this is Project Moorcroft. It's a program that will be Xbox's push to bring back the game demo. There's not a lot of detail on this yet, but so far we know that Xbox plans to compensate game developers for the demos and provide analytics on how users interact with those demos. This is actually really cool. Just having the analytics from YouTube, for example, it opens up this whole other level of figuring out once you launch the product. In this case, it's videos. In their case, it's games. You can understand, like, did people hate it? And at what point did they start to hate it? And that's great feedback because it allows everybody to improve. Now, it can be twisted at times, obviously, but we find it very helpful. And for game developers, especially maybe indie, smaller game development groups, having some analytics on here's how users interacted with your demo, here's sort of the player retention over time, it would help people figure out things that really drive me crazy in games. So for example, like tutorials, where they hold your hand. How long until the player says, let me play the damn game or I'm quitting? And that's what I think the analytics are trying to solve. Now we'll see if Xbox just ends up using it for whatever Microsoft may want to do with the analytics. And they want to allow Game Pass users to trial curated segments of upcoming games ahead of the release. And of course, this harkens back to a time when your favorite PC or gaming magazines came with CDs as part of the reason you would buy the magazine. Gordon Mahon, looking at you from the Maximum PC days. I definitely got a couple of CDs from the old magazines that were actually they had games I had never heard of that I liked. So anyway, a little bit of nostalgia here, but we'll see if it turns into anything useful. So Xbox also talked about expansions in its cloud gaming segment, and Xbox said it will be partnering with Samsung to bring a new app to Samsung smart TVs that would allow players to basically just do direct game streaming to the TV without an intermediary device. They said this is for Game Pass Ultimate users, and it will allow them to stream cloud-enabled games straight to the TV. In addition to the paid Game Pass Ultimate games, users will also be able to play Fortnite without a subscription to the Game Pass service. This will require logging into a Microsoft account from the Samsung Gaming Hub or the Media Hub and pairing a Bluetooth controller with the TV. At this point, it just seems like the company means any Bluetooth controller, not just Xbox controllers. Xbox went on to announce that the cloud gaming beta is now extended into Argentina and New Zealand markets, and it'll allow Game Pass Ultimate members there to stream cloud-enabled games to smartphones, tablets, PCs, and Xbox models, and to the freshly announced Samsung Smart TV app. Now, game streaming, we've always been mixed on, obviously. First of all, it has major latency issues where anything that starts to get more reflex intensive, like basically every FPS, feels bad when you're using game streaming services. Google Stadia claims negative latency, and that's not a thing. You can't do that without time travel or some other wormhole type of trick. So we have not yet found a game streaming service that brings the true on-device gaming experience, and there's a sort of a wider issue of more clawing away of what a consumer owns or purchases versus what is sort of leased to you. And we're already there with games, where you're leasing access to games on a lot of these digital distribution platforms, but then leasing access to the hardware as well. It's just, there was a time when you could buy software like Adobe Premiere or video games, and now that time is gone and we pay subscriptions instead. And it looks like hardware is next on the hit list for these companies. Anyway, Xbox also plans to let Game Pass Ultimate members play games they already own, not part of Game Pass. How exactly that will work, though, has not been detailed at this time. Moving to non-cloud stuff, Microsoft just said for PC users, you should be paying attention, that improvements to playing games in windowed mode will be rolling out soon. There's no exact release date yet, but originally they mentioned in February this year that this was being tested for Windows Insider, and the goal is to improve latency and performance, enable certain features like auto HDR, for example, variable refresh rate in windowed mode, and push those out for gaming. Moving on to the Xbox and Bethesda Games Showcase live event, Xbox talked about notable games on the horizon. All the games mentioned are targeted to launch within the next 12 months or so. Todd Howard of Bethesda showed off gameplay for the highly anticipated Starfield, or as Mr. Howard likes to call it, Skyrim in space. If you didn't already think that Bethesda is obsessed with Skyrim, there's certainly more reason to think so now. This is the first new IP from Bethesda in about 25 years, and it features a what it calls NASA punk art style. Starfield has been in development since late 2015, but was in the developers' minds much earlier, with the name being trademarked in 2013. Now, Xbox has partnered with Kojima Productions to create a game, quote, like no one has ever experienced or seen before, leveraging leveraging the power of the cloud. And then went on to provide zero detail whatsoever. It's an episode of Silicon Valley. Hertzbleed is a new CPU vulnerability. Intel posted some documentation on this, and so did AMD, about how it affects their products. It's a new family of side channel attacks with a different attack vector, and they are called frequency side channels. The worst case allows extraction of cryptographic keys from remote computers. No, that doesn't just mean cryptocurrency, but the actual source word, cryptographic. And true mitigation falls to developers at this point using constant time best practices, which we'll talk about in a moment. So Intel posted information about a new CPU vulnerability disclosure this week. The Hertzbleed vulnerability affects nearly all modern x86 CPUs, similar in that regard to Spectre. AMD and Intel are both affected here, and a joint research team from UTA, UIUC, and UW, the universities, published a paper describing the new family of frequency side channels. The group reported that the worst case scenario for this vulnerability would allow attackers to use Hertzbleed to get into cryptographic key extraction. The root cause is the frequency scaling behavior of modern processors with features like Intel's Turbo Boost and AMD's Precision Boost. So it's not a bug, it's a feature. And the researchers went on to explain this. They said, quote, Hertzbleed takes advantage of our experiments showing that under certain circumstances, the dynamic frequency scaling of modern x86 processors depends on the data being processed. This means that on modern processors, the same program can run at a different CPU frequency and therefore take a different wall time. Now, another type of side channel attack, or power side channel, is similar but requires a power measurement interface. Hertzbleed does not require such a device, and it can be thought of as turning power side channel attacks into remote timing attacks. Timing attacks rely on complex analysis of the time it takes for code to execute against differing data sets. The Hertzbleed website went on to say the following: the cause is that under certain circumstances, periodic CPU frequency adjustments depend on the current CPU power consumption, and these adjustments directly translate to execution time differences. 1 Hertz equals 1 cycle per second, they remind us. Typically, ensuring that cryptographic programs take the same amount of actual wall time to execute against both correct and incorrect keys would guard against this kind of attack. This concept is referred to as constant time. However, the researchers claim that current best practices on how to write constant time code, like Intel's, are not sufficient to guarantee constant time execution on modern processors. And speaking of Intel, the company has since published an article titled Frequency Throttling Side Channel Software Guidance for Cryptography Implementations. Now this, of course, is commonly abbreviated as FT, SC, SG, FCI. It's much easier to say it that way than reading the whole title. Anyway, that's coincidentally the name for Intel's next mobile CPU. So See you all next week. Intel said this about the behavior, quote, "There is an inverse correlation between the average throttling frequency and the power consumption before frequency throttling. A workload with higher power consumption before throttling tends to run at lower average throttled frequency, and vice versa. Furthermore, since the power consumption of a workload may be correlated with the data being processed, the throttling frequency may also be correlated with the data, which becomes a frequency side channel. The CPU frequency change also causes a difference in the execution time of the workload and results in a timing side channel." Now, this diagram we're putting on the screen contained within Intel's article illustrates the situation well. Intel recommends using instructions whose execution time is data independent in order to mitigate timing side channels, especially for developers of cryptographic algorithms. Intel gives substantial detail for developers in its articles if you are one. As for what this affects, so the vulnerability was explicitly tested against Coffee Lake Refresh, Comet Lake, Rocket Lake, Ice Lake, and Tiger Lake, with researchers claiming that it also worked against AMD Ryzen processors. AMD responded to this. It confirmed the affected CPUs in its own bulletin. It stopped short, though, of naming the AMD Ryzen 5000 series. We don't know if that's because it's not affected or because they just chose not to name them at this time. But they did list the Ryzen and Threadripper lines basically up until then, other than 5000. Up next, if you're like Wendell from Level 1 Techs and you think teaching Santa to think was a mistake, wait until you see what they've done to plastic.
Thanks, Steve.
At least it's abundant. University of Illinois researchers have designed the world's first high-yield processors that are made out of plastic instead of using standard silicon. The engineers worked with the British company Pragmatic, or Pragmat IC, which we've actually covered before in the news, and the manufacturing of this design has been dubbed FlexiCore. This isn't the first time a processor has been made of plastic, with the very first being created in 2011 in Europe by researchers at the IMEC and TNO organizations. The processor was 8-bit, it contained 4,000 transistors, and it ran at 6 Hertz. Not mega, just 6 Hertz. More recently, in 2021, ARM reproduced its M032-bit microcontroller in plastic. Neither of these earlier designs, though, had good yields, so they couldn't hit the low-cost goal of this FlexiCore approach. No plastic processors have been manufactured at any scale, at least until now. So FlexiCore, from what we were reading of the research, is at a point where it has both 4 and 8-bit designs, and this is to help minimize the size and maximize the yields. They were saying that 81% of the 4-bit designs came out functional, so that would be your yield. It's 81%, pretty good actually, especially by silicon standards. And this is good enough to lower the cost per processor down to, they're saying below 1 cent each. The 8-bit version did not yield as well, but we don't know what the yield number actually was at this point. So for the processors, they're made using a flexible thin film semiconductor called indium gallium zinc oxide, or IGZO. We're gonna go with IGZO on that for the future. IGZO can function even when bent around a radius as tight as a few millimeters. In order to achieve this, the engineers couldn't just copy a design intended for silicon, but had to make their design from scratch with plastic in mind. The low 4 and 8-bit logic, the separation of memory with instructions from memory with data, and cutting down the instruction set itself all helped. Additionally, instructions are executed in a single clock cycle rather than a multi-step pipeline like all the modern CPUs have. One of the engineers said, quote, "In general, we were able to simplify the design of FlexiCores by tailoring them to the needs of flexible applications, which tend to be computationally simple." So for size of these things, the 4-bit design is 5.6 square millimeters, and it has 2,104 what they call semiconductor devices in it. This is comparable in the research to Intel's 4004 from 1971, which had 2,300 transistors. Cheap and flexible processors like this have a few applications that come to mind immediately. Some of the ones we were reading about and thinking of would include a flexible gas sensor wrapped around a pipe to detect a leak. This is one of the ones that was listed. And then could also be less useful for things like packaging on food that's interactive. Maybe it's attached to some kind of relatively dumb sensor to tell you if the food or the milk or whatever's bad. Theoretically, you could use it for that as well. But get ready for smart everything. It's coming. It's only so long until our fork can tell us when to stop eating. Up next, a really quick one. This is about AMD. This is from leaker WXNod on Twitter. who shared the alleged launch date of AMD's socket AM5 Ryzen CPUs, the Ryzen 7000 processors. We already know from AMD formally that it's targeted for fall of this year. It's not a very wide window. But we have a more firm target at this point. WXNOD claims this photo was taken at AMD's China event, and it's a slide displaying the socket AM5 with some Chinese characters next to it. The slide reads, 9月15号, so it's just September 15th, and then it says on sale after September 15th. So easy enough. The AM5 product launch, at least in China, is expected for on-shelf availability at that time. We'd expect they would do a worldwide launch. These CPUs normally are. And we read some other text around the borders and the edges of the image, and there's nothing interesting there. It's mostly just talking about prior launches, 5000 series, stuff like that. So that's all there is to this one. Lines up with what AMD has said publicly, and we'll let you know when there's more information. Now, relatedly, we have another rumor propagator here. This one, Greymon55, tweeting an alleged set of CPU names for the Ryzen 7000 series. Be prepared to be shocked and surprised at the names. Greymon55 says the names will be 7950X, 7900X, 7800X, and 7600X. Where do they ever come up with these names? It's amazing. It's like every year they just invent new numbers out of nowhere. 7? That didn't exist before. All these names, of course, on existing products. So probably they'll be R9, R7, and R5 as well. But that's what we know for now, at least for the initial launch, follows the 5000 series. Next one, AMD's Phoenix Point APU engineering sample was revealed. So this is probably one of the last leak we're talking about for this week. This one is from Twitter bot BenchLeaks, which picked up an unknown AMD CPU this week in a database for Milky Way at home. The database entry reports, quote, Family 25 Model 112 stepping 0, and it says 16 cores, which is likely or 16 processors is what it says, which is likely the number of threads. So this information lines up with existing Phoenix Point mobile CPU information that we have officially from AMD. We've reported on it. It's not new there. And it aligns for AMD's notebook roadmap. Phoenix Point will be 4nm chips containing Zen 4 CPUs, RDNA 3 graphics, and support for DDR5. Finally, some smaller product news, some fun stuff just to keep us grounded with the industry, what's going on in the DIY enthusiast space. So Lian launched its new Unifan. The Unifan's already been out for a while, but they have an updated version. That's the one that clicks together with pin-to-pad contact between the frames of the fans, which eliminates individual cabling for each fan, at least in between or following the first one of the link that connects to the hub. So sequentially, you get to eliminate cables. So this new one is the Unifan SL INF 120. The INF stands for Infinity. This uses an Infinity mirror hub. It's at 0.5 millimeters of depth, and it reflects, as one would expect, infinitely. As long as you count the approximately 7 reigns as roughly infinite anyway, but close enough. 7's it's a new number. AMD just invented it, so we're glad that Lian Li's making use of this one. The fans carry a pattern to them. The housing has the same infinite mirror pattern to it, and it uses 40 LEDs distributed among the hub and the fan chassis, the frame, and this is supposed to be out now, so I don't know. We probably won't review it, but maybe we'll do a build with it. Maybe we could review it once we're rolling with the fan testing, but be a good build at least. Last one, Alphacool launches some thermal paste. Not particularly interesting, but we're paste addicts here. We have a lot of thermal paste, and we spend a lot of time smelling thermal paste. Don't ask questions. The Apex is supposed to be a high-performance paste. Alphacool markets this one as being high performance with its 17 watt per meter Kelvin thermal conductivity. Now, important thing here, thermal conductivity is measured using different parameters from different manufacturers, so you really can't compare them cross-brand because they're going to make the one that tests with parameters that create the highest number is going to look a lot better than the one that tests with parameters that create a lower number, even though they might actually be the same. It's okay, though, to compare typically within the same brand. That works out all right. So this is 4 grams for the syringe, and it's about $16. I look forward to getting demonetized by YouTube for saying 4 grams syringe and sniffing thermal paste. But you can go to store.gamersnexus.net. That'll help us out if we're demonetized. Or patreon.com/gamersnexus for bonus videos. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.